Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. On behalf of my classmate Max, we'd like to welcome you to the Green Building panel. We're very excited about our panel today. Moderating it is Gail Brager from UC Berkeley Center for Built Environment. Charlie Huizinga, I was going to mess that up. Also from UC Berkeley and a co-founder of Adora Technologies. We have Sandy Mindler, principal from Mithun, and Steve Selkowitz, senior scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Unfortunately, our fourth panelist, Scott Moldovan, was snowed in Texas, so I think that's climate change at work. Unfortunately, he won't be here with us today, but I'm going to turn it over to Gail now, and thanks to all of you for coming out.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Well, the conference today is addressing Berkeley's leadership role in global energy challenge. And I've seen a lot of focus on sustainable sources of alternative energy, but the panel today is going to make an argument that we believe the fastest and most cost-effective way to address climate change is to look more carefully at how we use energy, and within the building sector in particular. So I sometimes like to think about the energy supply and demand challenge using the leaky bucket metaphor. So if you've got a bucket full of holes, doesn't it make sense to plug up the holes first before you start looking for alternative sources of water to pour into the bucket? And that's a little bit about what conservation and energy efficiency in buildings is all about. And I believe those approaches must go hand in hand. But all too often, I think the supply side is the sexier side, and there's maybe more obvious business opportunities, so more money gets plugged into it. But it's not necessarily, we believe, where you can have the biggest and most fastest and most cost-effective impact. So I would argue that we first need to figure out how to reduce our demand for energy in buildings. Then we have to figure out and utilize how to increase the efficiency within which we deliver that energy. And then finally, you look at how to supply that energy through alternative and renewable sources. So depending on how the numbers that you look at, and they do vary, buildings in the US account for on the order of a third or greater of this country's energy use and carbon emissions. And as such, improving the performance of our buildings represents not only a significant opportunity to make a difference in the global climate challenge, but it also simultaneously offers great opportunities for innovations in technology and business. So our purpose in today's symposium is to have a conversation about this. We have three very distinguished panelists who each of them are interdisciplinary in their own activities, and individually and collectively they represent the worlds of applied research, design, product development, and entrepreneurship. And so what we want to do today is, our format is to ask each of them to make a brief statement about some of the what they see as the key challenges and opportunities in low energy and zero energy buildings and associated technologies. And then we want to spend most of our time opening it up to questions and answers, so we can use your interests and concerns and questions to continue that dialogue. So we are going to go in order from your right to your left. So I'm going to ask Steve Selkowitz to start us off.
Great. Thank you, Gail. And I'm going to run through a lot of material, partly to stimulate questions, and partly you can catch up with me later afterwards. I guess, Max, you're pushing the button, so I'll just tell you when to go. There's a URL, an email address and other information. So I'm part of a large group at the lab, 250 people, that works on buildings and has been working on buildings for 30 years or so. And so we bring a lot of sort of insight and expertise to the problem. I'm going to give you a sort of a high-level view and then identify what I think are some of the critical current issues. And I'm going to focus this around the theme of zero-energy buildings. It picks up on one of John's themes that, you know, changing light bulbs isn't really enough. We have to be much more aggressive in what we're doing. So next slide, please. So this is the context that Gail talked about. If you hit the button one more time, the real issue here, I would argue, is energy efficiency. That's not to say that we shouldn't be aggressively pursuing all these other options. I don't know if many of you know, but I have a background in nuclear energy. Can you do the next one, please? This is me in junior high school, and this is experimental boiling water reactor. But I got smart after that and switched to the energy field. So Okay, yeah. And so I hear Jesse James was once asked, why do you rob banks? And the answer is, that's where the money is. So why do energy efficiency in buildings? Because that's where the energy is. Buildings are 40% or so of the energy and carbon, greater percent of the electricity use, are the fastest growing. You can see the transport and industry down below. So if you're going to solve the U.S. energy problem, you're not going to do it without addressing the end use in the buildings. Next, please. And the problem here, it would be nice if there was a silver bullet. John used that phrase too, that you could do one thing to buildings and you'd be finished. But in fact, if you sort of look one level down, the end use is broken up into lots of little pieces. And you have to tackle many of them, and I'm going to argue you have to tackle the interactions between many of them in order to sort of take the next step. Next slide. So one of the things that, they were talking at lunch about how does the VC work in the internet world, in the green world, in the biofuels world. And if you're going to do anything useful in the building sector, you have to understand it. And it's a pretty complicated sector. It's fragmented, diverse. People make decisions in fairly complicated ways. Economics are big, important drivers. I won't go through all of these here. Long lifetimes. When you make a decision about this building, it's around for 50, 60, 70 years. So there's a real penalty for not doing it right the first time. And it's very diverse. The thinking that UC goes through and the way it owns and operates the building is very different than, say, a spec developer in terms of how it looks at the ownership issue. If Scott was here, he would talk a lot more about the financial part. Next, please. So what can we do to impact use? If we take the commercial sector, I guess this top one is a little bit dim here, but this is the energy use in the commercial sector in the US, and it goes up, growing nominally out to 2050, thanks. The AB 32, which was mentioned before, is this dot here, and the governor's executive order is the dot way on the right at 2050, way down. That's the 80% reduction that John talked about. That's the 20 or 25% reduction. So here's a scenario that brings the commercial building sector down in line with those savings. But look at what you have to do. You have to save 60 to 90% of the energy in every new building built from now on. And you have to go after maybe 10% of the existing buildings each year and save half of the energy. And that is an extraordinarily difficult job. It's an impossible job right now with the policies we have today, with the actions we take today. So the good news is, technically, from a sort of a straight engineering point of view, you could do this, but we have to really change the way we do almost everything in order to make it happen. Next. So let me launch into some of the pathways for solutions. One of the problems with buildings in particular is, and I talked about the 50-year sort of cycle plus or minus, but they go through a long, complicated process with lots of different players, lots of different decision makers, design, construction, operation, and so on. And you really have to get it right every step of the way. The best architect in the world with the best design in the world, if it's not executed properly and not operated properly, is not going to save the energy expected. So there's a life cycle issue here, and sort of underlying that, then, there's an interesting IT issue that the information that's generated in the early phases needs to be available to the operators later on, and the mechanics and the details of doing that are not straightforward and not trivial. Next. Buildings themselves are complicated, integrated systems. Again, you can't see the details here. But buildings are not simply an assembly of light bulbs and heaters and furnaces. All of these things interact in complex ways. And in order to really get beyond the 10, 20% savings into the 60, 70, 80% savings, you have to understand and optimize all those interactions. Next. So here's an example of some. This is a peak electric load in a building around here on a hot summer day. About half of the peak energy is cooling and lighting. So you can play games with if I let daylight in. If those blinds are open, the daylight comes in, I can have the electric lights off. That saves energy. But the light's coming in and the cooling goes up. So if I block all the light out, the cooling goes down, but now the lights are on. What's the trade-off? Which is the best thing to do? And then even if I knew what to do, how would I actually do it? Am I going to be running around the buildings, pulling shades and blinds and flipping light switches? Next. So if you think about that, I'm taking a piece of the problem now as an optimization, integration optimization problem. You have lots of things to play with, the blinds, the shades, the glass, the daylight, and you want to pay attention to comfort and people in the space as well. It's not just an engineering problem. You've got a utility out on the right there sending signals over meters, maybe real-time pricing. And then what's the metric that you're talking about? Is it energy? Is it demand? Is it carbon, which can be different from all of these? Is it dollars? And the action you take might vary depending upon what your key drivers here were. Next. So if you think about some of the research that you do towards that, this is the kind of work we do at the lab. Say, okay, I've got a dynamic system. I can control the solar gain coming through. I can do it with a motorized blind. I can do it with a thin film coating. I can control the lights with some kind of light dimming system, and the little circles are meant to be sensors and meters and so on. So I need a smart controller that knows what's going on in the outside world, what the people in the space are doing, what the utility's doing. Some of these things I can control, some of them I can't, and under all conditions I need to be able to make the right adjustment to optimize cost, comfort, et cetera. In advance I may not even know what that is. So that's a neat engineering problem. Next. And you can tackle it in a lab environment. So this is a little building we built up at the lab a few years ago, 3 side-by-side rooms, and this happens to be some smart glass. This is a company, a small company in Minnesota that recently got a big VC investment. They got DOE funding for a number of years to get a sort of a small product out, and then got about $15 or $20 million recently to build a plant and make these things at scale. And we spent a lot of time studying the detailed performance of these, but in a small environment, a small context of an office. Next. So then the question is, I'm trying to pick up on some of Dora's comments today. How do you scale this? So this is a building that was just finished in New York City, the New York Times. This is a $1 billion building, 1.5 million square feet. And it's one thing to test something in a lab on the hill here or in a lab on campus. It's another thing to deploy it at the scale of 1 million square feet. So architects had designed a nice looking, this is an artist's, this is a CAD drawing at the moment here, nice looking building that was all glass, and there's lots of reasons for glass, good and bad, having to do with sort of being able to see out and visibility and the theme of the Times interest in news. But the real issue they came to us with was they knew they had a problem, they knew they had a cooling problem, they knew they had a glare problem, they knew they had an opportunity to save lighting energy. They went to their consultants and said, how do we do this at scale? How do we deploy a system that will work right and be affordable and do all the right things that I showed you about before every time? And the consultants basically told them it couldn't be done, and if it could be done, you couldn't afford it anyway. Next. So we convinced them that we convinced them partway that it could be done, but the way to find out if it could be done for real was to build a mock-up on the upper right there, which was a part of the floor in full scale, and put in all the technologies they were thinking about using. We did extensive testing, not only of energy measurements, but of the lighting quality and glare and so on in the space. And the outcome of this then was feedback to the manufacturers, to the vendors, to supply a new generation of products that didn't then exist in the market. Next. And we worked with them to test and evaluate the proposed products. We built tools for them so that they would know that once they were installed, it would work. This is the real building occupied last year, a photo inside showing, you can't see all the details, but the lights are off and dimmed appropriately, and the shades go up and down. They're motorized shades that operate automatically. So here's one scale up from a kind of couple hundred square feet to 1 million square feet, and now we have to go from one building to hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of buildings. Next. So the last 2 slides then sort of are how do you go from scale? So there's a scale of a research lab to a first couple demonstration buildings, and then there's a scale from a few demonstration buildings to standard practice in industry. And so this just brings back my themes. You have to pay attention to life cycle, you have to pay attention to the integration issues, and I think this picks up Dora's theme as well, that this is technology is part of it, but policy, behavior, lifestyle, decision-making, you really have to understand those and use those to leverage the technology part. Next, one of the ways we're doing this, next slide, is we put together a consortium of large organizations. These are the groups AIA, ASHRAE, U.S. Green Buildings Council that drive the commercial sector to do this initiative. And in fact, one of the main goals, again, this repeats Dora's comments, is to go to the federal government and get funding at the level of $200 million a year to push a program like this forward. The goal being that by 2030, every new building built should be a zero energy building. A zero energy building is a building that uses only 10, 20, 30% of what current buildings do, and the remainder is supplied by PV or wind or renewables. That can be done today by exceptional architects. Sandy could do that with exceptional clients, in the right climate, but it can't be done routinely, cost-effectively, every time, everywhere, which is what needs to happen in the next 10 or 20 years. So this is an activity, as sort of the idea here is to get the community together and do the research that's needed, change the policy as needed, put the financing things in place, do all the things needed to make it possible. Next. So my last thoughts, and maybe to stimulate discussion later, it's a quote I found from Henry Ford, which I think is good. If you go out and ask our owners and even architects what they want, they don't tell you they want zero energy buildings because they don't know that they're desirable, feasible, or possible. That's the theme that John was talking about as well, of letting people know what can be done and what should be done. This is a quote from that I read. It was actually something that Friedman wrote in the Times, which is, think big, start small, and act now. If you don't think big, you're never going to get to the end result. If you think big but only think big, you never get started because the problem is overwhelming and you don't know what to do first. And we simply can't afford to wait, so we're sort of going out and doing stuff, starting things, and then we'll sort of add along the way. Finally, the title of this session was about green. And I haven't used that term much or at all here. I focused on energy efficiency. In my view, energy efficiency is an essential part of being green. There's two extreme schools of thought here. The Kermit the Frog thing is, every light bulb I screw in is green, and every magazine you pick up these days, 45 ways of being green. Those are all well and good, and we should be doing all those things, but they aren't enough. And Friedman, who's the editorial writer for the Times, or one of them, who's got a new book coming out, he gave a talk around here a few weeks ago, and he made this comment, and I'm not sure I agree completely, but I'm throwing it out because it might be a good starting point for discussion at the end. If it doesn't hurt, it's not green. I think what he's trying to say, of course, is saying it for effect, but you really have to change. Some change may hurt, some change won't hurt, but the kind of change we need to get to the planet that I think we all want is not going to be achieved simply by doing the simple, easy things that we're doing today.
Great, thank you.
It's not even, okay.
Yeah.
I haven't watched him for a
We
while.
have to find somebody else to get that quote from.
Okay. I'm curious how many people in the room are involved in the building, design, or construction industry? Yeah, that's what we were thinking. Maybe not very many of you. That's interesting. That's good. So hopefully we'll help share some of the issues and drivers that are out there right now. In my little piece of introductory remarks, I'd like to underscore for a moment the urgency and then also talk a bit about the incredible opportunity that is out there. So all of you who are in the business world, how many of you in the business world? Yeah, there's an incredible opportunity here and lots of money to be made around this issue. The next one, please. So this is a little, as an architect, it's really helpful, I find, to get simple about some of these complex issues and just to talk for a minute about the carbon cycle, carbon sequestered, carbon released into the atmosphere. You're looking at land and water. Next one, please. About 2 billion tons sequestered on land. Next one, about 8 billion tons sequestered in the water, with a little bit less every day as the water gets warmer. Next one, please. About 20 tons going into the atmosphere. So, it's kind of interesting that we talk a lot about there being too much carbon in the atmosphere. We're emitting at a rate that's twice what it should be. So it's not a small disconnect, it's actually a very large disconnect. So that's the urgency piece. Next one, please. Also, Steve already mentioned the issue about the building sector contribution. I think it's pretty interesting. The U.S. energy use, about 100 quads, about 40 quads of that related to the building industry. 10 years ago, it was a smaller percentage, but the building industry keeps going higher, whereas the other industries are getting moderately more efficient. Next one. And then if you look, you're looking at the bars, the gray bar and the purple bar, looking at the difference in energy use in just 10 years. So you can see in Asia and Europe the incredible increase in energy use with slightly different proportions in other parts of the world, but we're seeing rapidly increasing energy use globally, even though everybody's talking about efficiency. Next one. And the reason we're seeing this is because of population growth as well as rising prosperity. So, to me, in a nutshell, this says if we're looking at U.S. energy consumption going up by 34%, and that includes efficiency gains that are already planned, and we're looking at global energy use going up by 62%. Clearly, in the green building movement, which is a big deal these days, the LEED rating system is a big deal, energy efficiency in buildings is a big deal, the 20 to 30% gains that are being made in energy efficiency routinely by green buildings are not helping this problem sufficiently. Next one, please. So incremental efficiency gains are not going to get us there. And so anyway, so that's just a frame of mind. Let's think differently about the issues and opportunities related to buildings. Next one. So, I mean, we shouldn't let go of the fact that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and a lot of the developers and the federal government and all the various people that are joining the green building movement are very happy to find the 20 to 30% improvements that can be kind of described as low-hanging fruit. You know, picking out the right light fixtures and using more insulation and using smarter equipment in buildings gets us those kinds of gains. The integrated design solution, which I want to talk about a little bit, gets us more substantial gains. We can actually begin to change to a much larger extent the way energy is used in buildings. And then if we use integrated design with renewables, as Steve said, we get to the zero energy building. So these begin to be interesting. And I think what's particularly important to keep in mind is that the difference between the low-hanging fruit approach and the integrated design approach is actually design. It's not just that we change the kit of parts, but we put them together in a different way. So our culture is one that's more of an expert-based culture where individuals excel in their areas of expertise. And the mind shift we need is to go from the expert-based culture to more of a collaborative and integrated design approach where there's an understanding of the interactions between the various components and a different way of designing. And that's what we're seeing with the leading buildings that are creating different results. Next one, please. So this one by Kieran Timberlake, a good firm in Washington, D.C. This has gotten a lot of press. I just want to show you that there are other architects, too, doing all this good work. Beautiful buildings, 70% less energy used in a school building. Next one. But really a look at the way the building's organized, how it's oriented on the site, how it relates to the sun, natural ventilation, geothermal, et cetera. Also with it's a renovation and addition. It's not all a new building. Next one, please. This one, a housing project. This one's one of the Methuen projects, but looking at changing the way the building is organized so that natural airflows can be accommodated, as well as better insulation, as well as sun control, and all things that are fairly pragmatic and not radical, but integrated in a thoughtful way, the pieces put together so that the interactions are addressed, and we're saving 70% of the energy. Next one. And you can see just that organizationally it's not radical, but it's different, and there's a way of addressing the inputs and outputs of energy. Next one, please. And then this one is a fun project, a recent project I've been involved with at HOK, looking again at how to get natural airflows to interact with a better insulated building envelope, better daylighting response, more efficient systems throughout. In this building, we're able to move air and keep people cool without a single fan moving air through the building in the office portions of the building. In the laboratories, it's a little different. We need a few fans. But it is kind of remarkable to think about working with systems. This is a passive ventilation system where air is captured on the roof in a wind scoop, and it moves through a channel in the building, distributed through the floor and through natural airflows. The air moves through the building and is exhausted without the need to use power for moving that air, and also using seawater cooling for the cooling and dehumidification. People used to say that you can't do natural ventilation in a hot and humid climate, and we were really happy to be able to prove that it could be done and to show and demonstrate this. Bill Browning calls this the art of the possible. There's a whole series of buildings being created now that are using the same kind of pieces and parts. It's not radical. They're putting them together in a different way and getting remarkably more efficient results. And so we are seeing these projects that then will, I think, inspire and motivate the next generation of projects. Next one. So the next thing I wanted to put on the table, this is just the interior. That's the central atrium is not only providing daylight, but it's part of the ventilation system, also water capture and reuse as well. It's all an integrated system. Next one. So then the other idea I just wanted to put on the table was this idea of integrated design at the neighborhood scale, which is really, I think, the next frontier that we all need to address. Next one, please. So there was a little bit of discussion about this at the plenary talk over lunch. You know, buildings use 70% of the electricity in the U.S. However, more than half of the energy used by buildings is losses. Look at that purple wedge of space of energy represented in this chart. Because energy, next one please. So I thought this was amazing. I was doing a little research over the summer, and I was actually shocked to realize that energy generation, electricity energy generation in the United States is less efficient today than it was in 1900. It's only half as efficient in the US as it is in Europe. We're not even talking about carbon, we're just talking about energy in versus energy out. So US power plants are, the conversion efficiency is about 30%. There's tremendous opportunity. So we were looking at energy use within the building. Most of it's electricity, and can we be smart and go from 100% down to 50% or down to 30%? Well, what if then we look at the next scale and we say, what if all the energy that was used in that building was generated at 85% efficiency instead of 30% efficiency? Well, that's a pretty incredible opportunity. Because the energy that's going into the building, there's this whole opportunity to shift the efficiencies of production and distribution and then shift, therefore, the total energy use of the building. Next one. So just this is kind of pictorial to look at where energy comes from. And best case scenarios are predicting that energy use globally is going to go from 13 terawatts to 30 terawatts. That's if we're efficient, and if we're smart and everything. Looking at projections in population, we're still adding about 17 terawatts. Next one. So here we go, 16 terawatts from 16,000 nuclear power plants. We could do that to solve the problem. Next one. We could put hydro on every single river in the world, and we might get 2 terawatts. Next. We could put wind capacity everywhere where there's wind, and we're getting about 5 to 10 terawatts there. Next one. Or this is just, you know, this is slightly biased to promoting solar, photovoltaic, but I just want to show you proportionally it's pretty interesting to see the roof area to scale that would be required to produce 20 terawatts. So there's pretty much opportunity here, and then when you take into account the fact that energy generated on site doesn't suffer from transmission losses and all of those other things as well. So there's more direct application. So there's a big opportunity here, especially when we consider that photovoltaics are getting more efficient every day. Next one. So anyway, I just want to make that point about looking at the supply and generation side. What we're seeing now, this next frontier in the green building world, is really looking at the community, neighborhood, and urban scale, and looking at buildings that actually generate more electricity than they use once we get down to radically more efficient buildings, addressing all the water issues as well. There's a whole world of issues around water, and looking at, you know, the integrated system. So just put that on the table. We won't go into detail on that. Next one. And then the final thing I wanted to put on the table, and you could look at buildcarbonneutral.org if you want to play around with this thing. There's a demo of it there, and you can play around with this. But once we begin to look at the fact that we can get from buildings that use 100% of the energy down to buildings that might get pretty close to zero energy, then we're going to have to remember to look at how much carbon is embodied into the building materials themselves. So if you look over a 30-year lifespan, about 20% of the energy is actually the energy it took to create the building materials and to build the building. And we think of that as being a minor impact today because the 80% is the operational use. But once the operational use starts to shrink, we're going to look again and look more closely at the energy embodied in the materials. And this calculator is kind of clever because it allows you to, you could plug in your own building and find out what the embodied carbon is. But I think just want to put that on the table as well, that when we're looking at the whole energy issue with buildings, we should also remember the embodied piece. Thanks. And there's my email address if you'd like. Thank you, Sandy.
So I think both Steve and Sandy have made the point pretty clearly that this focus on integrated design and putting all these pieces together is the key piece of solving this problem. I'm going to also just focus down into another sort of direction, which is that there is a lot of low-hanging fruit out there, and it won't solve the problem, but we better pick it because it's pretty advantageous to us right now. And this is a little kind of story about some research that we took from our laboratory into the commercialization phase, and it might just be an interesting example for folks. Next. And I want to point out that UC Berkeley is such a unique place that sort of makes something like this possible. And this really came out of collaborations with the Center for the Built Environment, where I am, which is in architecture, collaborating with folks from engineering, from Citrus, the Berkeley Wireless Research Center, physical plant, the folks that are out there running the buildings on this campus, and then the Haas School of Business as we began to get into commercialization. So it's a pretty unique opportunity to have all these things together in a small spot and get people networking like this kind of conference really does. Next. The project I'm going to talk about started back in 2003 with some funding from our industry partners to look at the idea of applying some of this, some low-cost wireless radio technology which is being developed in the engineering laboratories, and apply it to buildings in a way that would allow us to better control lighting in commercial buildings. Next, this one more. And the problem I'm talking about here is on the upper right there, the classic situation in a commercial office building where you'd have a whole bunch of switches that control the lights in a seemingly arbitrary pattern. And so if anyone is in the building, all the lights are on. Often they're just behind a filing cabinet somewhere, or not atypically they're in a locked electrician's closet. So there's no way to control the lights the way people wanted to do it. So we built a little prototype of this device, next, and we installed it in our administrative offices. And what this allowed us to do is, it does not show up very well here, but in the little plan view on the left there, you can see there are 10 fixtures in this office that all came on and off together with a single switch. By installing these devices, we could give people a little controller that would allow them to turn the lights on and off above their own workspace. And we found two really interesting things from that. One is that we reduced the lighting electrical use by 40%, which is a kind of a dramatic effect there. And the other thing was that the people really liked having this control. In general, in commercial spaces, people don't have much control over their indoor environment. And so giving people some control over that is a very positive step forward. And in fact, that people have showed all kinds of connections between giving people control over their environment and increased productivity gains. And I want to kind of point out that this is sort of a merging of technology, but also enabling people to do something about their space, which is a big piece of it. We've seen this here that, this graph is just reflecting what both Steve and Sandy pointed out. Buildings use 2/3 or 3/4 of electricity in the country next. And in particular, I just want to point out that in the commercial buildings, lighting is a big piece of that. So if we can if we have this 40% reduction, which we saw in our particular application, that's a big piece of the pie in terms of reducing energy use and carbon footprint. Next. So we got some funding from the California Energy Commission, another player in this whole story, who allowed us to kind of push further the technical development and then do another pilot project on the business services group on campus. And we just scaled up a bit from original idea and gave people the ability to control their lights in their open plan office space. Next. And what we found there is instead of a 40% reduction, we found a 65% reduction in lighting use. And this is coming from a couple of important things. One is, generally spaces tend to be overlit for most people. It doesn't mean that's true for all the people all the time. In fact, some people like to have all the lights that are available for certain paper-based tasks, but when they're using their computers or other things, it's nice to turn the light off above you. You don't have that reflecting glare off your computer screen. And the other point is that if you walk around any open plan office, half the people aren't there half the time, or all the people aren't there half the time, really. It's about kind of 50% occupancy is sort of typical in this. So there's huge opportunities there. And with this technology in the upper right there, you're seeing some folks from physical plant who assisted us in doing this pilot. It takes about 5 minutes to install it per fixture, so it's an easy retrofit sort of technology. In the long term, it might have some interesting applications in new construction, but right now, it's easy to put in existing buildings, like this room right here, for example. Next. Oh, maybe just go back and forth there a couple times. You can see in the lower right how we're able now just to turn off individual lights above people's workstations. So you can take advantage of natural daylight or of use patterns, whatever it might be. Next. Now, what happened next then is I got together with some folks from the Haas School of Business here who approached me and said, you've got this interesting research. How can we get involved, and would you be interested in thinking about commercializing it? And I said, sure, sounds great. I had no idea how to go about commercializing something like this. And yet, on the other hand, my sort of nature is to be very applied. I love seeing things actually get done in real buildings, so I was excited about it. We formed a small company, myself and Zach Gentry and Josh Mooney, who are both graduates of the Haas program here. And we won this California Clean Tech Open in 2006, which is a great way of getting some, focusing some attention to it, but also, more importantly, giving us some office space for a year to kind of get going, and a little bit of funding. We're licensing the technology from UC Berkeley, and now our first commercial products have been installed on campus. So Berkeley is sort of the genesis of it, and now the first customer for this. In general, with these energy efficiency measures, institutional people like universities are great places because they have a longer term view of they're owning these buildings for a long time. They're willing to make investments in energy efficiency, even though these are pretty good investments, as you see. So we've developed some products which involve both the hardware that goes up in the fixtures and then some software. I'm not going into the details of the technology here so much, but the idea of is that not only do you give people control over the lights, but there's also a connection out to the internet. Of course, there always is with everything. So all this stuff can be controlled and monitored on the web. And not only are you controlling the lights, but you're also monitoring the energy use, so you can understand what the effect is on lighting energy. Next. So these are a couple now projects that have come back full circle. The technology which is developed here is now being installed here as a commercial product. This is the Moffett Undergraduate Library. We've done 2 floors of that building. The lights were previously on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It seems mind-boggling, but the only way to control them was from the circuit breakers in the closet, and the only people who had keys to that are the electricians, and it's just not going to happen. So in this case, by installing these devices, we're saving 100 megawatt hours per year. It's a less than a 3-year payback, not counting the incentives from the state for energy efficiency improvements. If you take that payback into account, it's about 3 or 4 months, I think, is the payback. So it's a really good financial investment for the university, and it's saving a bunch of energy. Next. Another library which we've done is the Doyle Reading Room. And if you've been in this space, it's a magnificent space, and it's got these beautiful skylights above. And the skylights is 2 layers of glass. There's the one you see there, and then there's an interstitial sort of attic space, and then more skylights above. And so it's a weatherproof up there. And inside that space are some high output fluorescent fixtures that are on, guess what, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because they're disconnected to a circuit breaker up in that space, which to control you need to go up to the 3rd floor, out onto the roof, up a ladder, through a little tunnel, up into another ladder, up on the roof, through a little entrance, and flip the breaker. So that's not going to happen. So in this case, we're also saving 70 megawatt hours. It's almost the same amount as in the other library. And because what we can do here is we're only turning the lights on now when the library is open at night, basically. So we have a little astronomical time clock. So if it's during daylight hours, they don't need to be on. The place is flooded with daylight. You can't tell if the lights are on. If you walk into that space during the day, well, now you'll see that they're off. But previously, you wouldn't have known where the lights are on and off. And now we can turn them on only at night, and then when the library closes, we can turn them off. So again, in this case, it's less than a year payback for this project, not counting the incentives. So with incentives, it's instant payback. So good opportunities here. Next. So just, again, to kind of reemphasize this point of how many players and partners were involved in this thing, and being on campus facilitated that, because all these people that are here in one place with a common interest and a wide range of skills. And so starting with our research funding from the Center for the Built Environment, going through all the players here, ending with the venture capital step, which I want to finish with, which I've been saying this for months here, but we're days away from sort of finalizing institutional investment from venture capital. Next slide. And we've all you've been hearing this point hammered, that this kind of first law maybe of zero emission buildings is efficiency first, then renewables. So that's the leaky bucket here that Gail was talking about. Everyone agrees with that, no problem. Next. If you look at the investment from the venture capital community, there's $3.4 billion going into renewables, and there's $350 million going into efficiency, a 10-to-1 scaling there. And I was glad to see 3 people in front of me ask the question to John Doerr about, well, why is there not, or what does it take to get investment in efficiency versus renewables? And I was disappointed, though. He just kind of, unless I missed it, he just kind of punted on that issue, which is sort of the message we're getting from the venture capital community. And the reason is, I think, largely is that, as Steve pointed out, it's a much more complex system and market to get into. It's not just produce the power, sell it wholesale, done. It's more complex than that. And so the financial models of how you extract value from this process are more difficult. But at the same time, the opportunity is huge. And so, you look at the paybacks for renewable energy, they're on the time scale of 20 years typically. And these efficiency measures on the time scale of 1 year, 2 years, months, whatever it might be. So an order of magnitude difference there. Next slide. How many of you are familiar with this, the Google RE Less Than C initiative? Just show of hands there. Okay, a lot of you. This is a pretty recently announced initiative by Google to try to make some strategic investments to get the cost of renewable energy below that of coal. So renewables cheaper than coal is essentially the method there. What I'd like to propose next is something even beyond that, which is efficiency less than a tenth of that. Okay, I mean, it's a really big difference there. We could get efficiency measures which were a tenth the cost, approximately. I'm just an order of magnitude here could have that kind of effect. And so, you know, the idea being that how do we attract that attention? I think it's a really interesting question. I saw a lot of hands from the business community here. I'd like to sort of get at that point a little bit with the discussion if we could too. Next, I think that's it.
Great, thank you. Wow, that's great, all three of you. I'd like to open it up now. Q&A.
I'd like to ask Charlie, can you talk about the last couple of years of evolution of teaching efficiency and alternative energy in the architectural school?
Okay.
Do we have the staff with a mic? Because I know you wanted to record questions. So
I was about to get
okay. So until we do that, if the questioner doesn't have a mic, if you could please repeat the question.
Well, the question was what's happened over the last couple of years in the teaching of these issues in the School of Architecture, particularly. And Gail, I'll have answered this. Probably spend some more time because she's probably the better qualified to speak in this than I. But I'll make a couple of points. One observation, which I think is exciting, is just in the level of interest from the students. I'm teaching a seminar this semester, a graduate seminar that historically I've had 10 students in, sometimes 8. This year I had 22 people sign up for it, and it limits 20. So there's great interest from the students of getting at this material. One of the challenges in it for us is we have a graduate program, a Master of Science program in building energy technology. One of the challenges for us is getting students, the right kind of students, into this kind of a program because it's an interesting, it's all interdisciplinary. We want some technical skills from designers, and so getting a track of getting students who have these technical skills who want to study this. There's not a program, an undergraduate program that is graduating people that's kind of a natural flow into this kind of this area. And so getting that connection is a struggle. So one of the reasons we're trying to reach out more and more to the campus community to find people in other programs that might be interested in this to try to get people together because it's blending of design and art and engineering all together in the same topic. So now as far as on the teaching and the opportunities on that side, I'm disappointed in it, I'd say, just to be as honest as I can, but I don't think we have enough to offer there to students. There's a huge interest, and I don't think there's enough attention being paid to that. I think there's a core group of us in our program that really think these are important issues and try to do what we can there, but I think it's not pervasive enough. And I think I would like to see, there's a lot of interest in the students. There's students now that are active in trying to increase the level of engagement with this across the design studios and places where it's really important to get designers, tied into these concepts. And I don't think we've done enough, though. Yeah.
Yeah. I won't take very long because there's a lot of questions. I think Charlie nailed it. It's really difficult in our department because we have undergraduates, graduates in the professional MArch track, research track, MS, PhD, and we can have students of all those categories in a single class. And so you have to figure out how to teach to all of those. So the students have a lot of influence, and as the students are pushing for more and more in this area, that then pushes on the administration to try to push for new faculty in this area. And it's a very complicated process to get approval to hire, but that's the direction we're going, and we're hoping in the next couple of years to hire more faculty. I'm going to keep switching back and forth to left and right. So, woman in the back there.
Yes, I was wondering, so you see the McKinsey report that came out recently with all of these negative, cost abatement opportunities, but you're not seeing too many of them get scooped up. I'm wondering if there's any way that carbon finance, that you foresee carbon finance playing a role in sort of incentivizing that initial investment to get people over the hurdle?
Right. Well, I wish we had Scott here and not in Dallas, but who wants to take that one on?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, do all of you know the curve she's talking about? It's a curve that shows there's a whole bunch of things you can do to save carbon that pay you back money, and there's a bunch of other things you do to save carbon that cost you money. If you look on the left side, the ones that pay you back are mainly buildings issues. And so it's an interesting challenge. I mean, you could ask, remember the examples Charlie showed there. If the lights have been on 24/7 for how many years, that building, right? why weren't they turned off before? That's a no-brainer for an ESCO. There are organizations called ESCOs that invest money. They put the capital up front. They capture some or all of the savings. They share the savings with the building owners. And if that worked well, you would capture a lot of that very low-hanging fruit, and obviously doesn't. So it's the old problem that markets aren't perfect, and markets miss huge opportunities. When you try to go a bit further than that, you get into the whole area of risk. Some of these things are truly no-brainers, and there's zero risk, and those presumably get finances. Others where people say, well, I'm not sure if it will really work right, or I'm not sure if people will use it the way we want it to. And therefore the savings aren't clear, and therefore the investment's at risk, and therefore the investment won't get made. So there's a really very, very wide spectrum, and we need smarter business models to capture the really obvious savings, and then maybe different risk management models to capture the ones in the middle. There was actually one corporation that did a very good job on risk management with efficiency. The company was called Enron. Anyone ever heard of that? There was a division in Enron, not the one you heard about in the news, that was capturing energy efficiency at large scale. A couple of people that work for us now used to work there. And they approached it as a risk management model, and they made investments in efficiency that cumulatively were aggressive and good, but for each individual building they were willing to tolerate more risk, and more got done. So not enough of that kind of out-of-the-box thinking gets done, and maybe some of you can help us there.
I just want to add one quick thing to that, which is to bring it to the campus level, that the financing mechanism for this stuff are so critical for getting investment in efficiency. And for example, on campus, you build a new building, and that comes from one budget, and then the folks that actually run the buildings, it's coming from a totally different budget, and often their budget doesn't even necessarily get increased when you build a new building. And so to make an investment in efficiency, you've got to take some money from one pot and invest it, and then presumably that's going to pay back, and like a 3-year payback, that's a pretty darn good investment in the market, right? If you're in the financial world, you jump all over that. A 10-year payback's not bad, right? But the problem is someone's got to make that first investment. Facilities here on campus doesn't have enough of a budget for that. And yet they're basically underfunded to run and operate the buildings. And so it's a question of getting the money coming from the right pot and coming back into another pot. So someone's paying for this, someone else is getting the money back. And it's just an institutional barrier to making smart decisions about how we manage it. And that's true of a lot of institutions, is that it's just not well thought out, and that creates a lot of barriers to getting these kinds of efficiency measures implemented.
It's like the analogy, integrated design, we need integrated finance. So left hand's talking to the right hand.
Berkeley is now doing a new downtown plan, and one of the key issues was the question of whether new buildings or adaptive reuse of existing buildings, how does the role of energy interplay in the two different concepts? There's a key battle going on constantly in Berkeley between preservationists and large-scale developers. So this issue came up, and I'm wondering what you folks think about it, what the different issues are involved.
Sounds like a Sandy question.
Yeah. There's all kinds of ways to be more energy efficient with both. Typically, older buildings use more energy than new buildings because they have older systems in them, and maybe not as good glazing, and not as good construction methods from when they were built, not as good materials from when they were built. So the older buildings do use more energy typically, but if there's going to be a renovation occurring, they can usually achieve the same levels of efficiency. It just needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. So I would say the opportunities for energy improvement exist in both. And
but how does that work in terms of cost versus a new building versus retrofit?
Well, it needs to be looked at. I think if it's a minor retrofit, there might, for instance, much of the energy in a smaller building has to do with what's called the building envelope. So how much heat or cooling leaks out of the building, and how much of it is, collected through the glass and the skin. So if there's going to be improvements made to the insulation and the glazing and to the infiltration, to slow down the infiltration, then you can get to the similar levels of efficiency as you could with a new building. But if it's a more minor renovation, then then there would have to be added investment to achieve those levels.
And the already embodied energy in the building.
Which is a great thing. Exactly. Then by reusing the building, the embodied energy, which would be 20% of the energy over a 30-year period, is not insignificant. In general, it's always better to reuse if it's a good, basic, flexible building, existing building.
Right. Okay, we'll keep the questions going. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually work for a utility in the area of energy efficiency, and the sort of frustration that I have is that most of the kind of things we can recommend to our customers are, oh, change out your lights, get a new air conditioner. Do you see any possibility for this kind of integrated design that you're talking about in existing buildings?
I thought you were going to ask about integrated energy planning. I think it would be just so amazing if urban design and urban planning would integrate energy infrastructure, so that one of the biggest costs utilities have is trying to get new plants permitted and trying to locate them in communities because everybody pushes back. So I will answer your question, but I do think one of the best opportunities is if the planning of energy infrastructure could be integrated with the planning of communities, which absolutely does not happen in the United States. Now, your question was more specifically about existing buildings, and could you remind me of your question?
Oh, how to incorporate this idea of integrated design into existing buildings.
Yeah, it's the same process really, because with existing buildings, there's the whole effort to figure out how to reuse them. So again, the same idea of getting a team of people together where the person who's choosing windows is talking to the person who's putting in a heating and cooling system so that they can find those synergies. So it's the same idea of not treating individual decisions in a piecemeal manner, but looking at the whole as a system.
Let me just add a bit to that. Until now, the PUC is the one that sort of drives what the utilities can do and what they get paid for. It was done in a 3-year cycle. The way the system was set up, basically it encouraged the utilities to do all the simple stuff, not the integrated stuff, because it was too complicated to figure out if I do 3 things and what's the total effect of them and how do I get credit for it. But they just changed their planning, and they have what they call their big bold initiatives, and they've now picked a 2030 goal for commercial buildings. The same thing we've been talking about, zero energy by 2030. And they're doing some planning to say, okay, how would we do that? And they're still doing their 3-year planning, but the 3-year planning will now be in the context of whatever it is, 22-year planning and that big, bold goal. And that will allow them to implement programs in the 3-year cycle that can contribute to the kind of integrated design and integrated planning. And that addresses, I think, both existing and new buildings as well. So you should see change coming out of the utility programs. The PUC spends, or the PUC allows the utilities to spend your utility money, your tax money, at the rate of about $1 billion a year. So they're not an insignificant player out there. And $1 billion a year of targeted programs can change the landscape, can encourage businesses, can help subsidize, if you will, new products and so on. So we could see some important change if that program gets played out appropriately.
Okay.
I'm wondering from an architecture perspective, but a lot of the folks in this room would be coming probably from the client perspective in terms of development, how integrated design can be a convincing thing. How do you actually get clients to say, okay, we're going to do integrated design? And then that's probably a long answer, but after that, how do you manage the relationships between the team members in terms of when you get people together, like could you walk us through that process and who gets to control decisions?
Well, it's always easiest to start an integrated design process at the beginning. And I think the very best thing a client or somebody who's commissioning a building can do is to ask good questions and to ask what is the optimal solution for this building? What is the most energy efficient design option? What are the options? How did you think about them? How can we make the choice about the best option? And I think sometimes owners hesitate to ask that question because they're afraid that if they ask the question that they're going to be obligated to choose the radical solution. But I think really without having the information, without asking the question, they don't allow themselves the opportunity to choose the best solution wherever it falls amongst the spectrum. So I think the client community needs to be trained to ask better questions, because it simply provides them with a better range of options and the ability to choose at the end of the day whichever option suits their purposes, whether it's first cost or whether it's value over time. In terms of setting up the process on the design team side, again, it has to do with establishing the process at the beginning and choosing team members that work well in a collaborative fashion. So typically in the industry, the architect would lead the team and would choose which engineers they would like to work with. So they would need to choose an engineer that wasn't simply someone who had a past relationship with the client, but they would choose an engineer who had a track record of doing collaborative, innovative work, and that would choose to engage in a process like that. So I think there's a bit of inertia in the industry that it's easier for people to rely on old prototypes for design rather than to look freshly at each problem. But the people who are accustomed to working in that way, very comfortable and find it to be an efficient way to work. So I think really, oftentimes it's the architect who needs, because they hold the primary contract with an owner typically, needs to initiate that kind of team structure. And I guess in my career, I've never had an instance where an owner would say, no, please don't do that. Please. I think it's a logical way to work, and actually people are surprised when they find out that it's not typical. So I think it's surprising for people to think that work is still being done in silos. The architectural and engineering world has been slow to change, and probably behind other industries that got integrated design a long time ago. So
okay, in the middle there.
Let's see. I've been in a few green buildings that didn't seem to work the way they were designed. I was wondering how good the tools are now. Like, let's say you come up with this neat kind of maybe experimental or newer design to make a building use less energy. How much can you tell before you actually build it?
Well, we've got two people from the Center for the Built Environment here, and they actually look at buildings and how they perform. So design professionals need to go through that process of looking at and evaluating buildings. And why don't you speak to that?
Well, one thing I'd say is that there's a lot of buildings that are not working well, and so you can have a very conventional building and then discover it's not working well, and people don't make a big fuss about it. But the expectations when you say it's going to be a green building, those buildings get a whole lot more press when they don't work. And then not working is defined in a lot of ways. I know some of the things that happen is that all buildings, whether conventional or green, however you want to categorize them, to work well need to go through a process called commissioning to really get the most out of it, and that's ensuring that a building is performing as designed. And we're finding that that's one of the key things that will truly make a difference. So if you occupy a building too quickly before that process happens, before you've kind of gotten the bugs out and tweaked it, and particularly green buildings that don't have the centralized controls and involve a lot of interaction, dynamic envelopes, those are more complicated. They might need the commissioning more than standard cookie cutter buildings. And so you have to give them a period of time to adjust and settle in before you make judgments. So typically what you want to do in learning about how buildings work is make sure that you've allowed for that period of adjustment, and then maybe come in repetitively so that you can use the post-occupancy evaluation as a way to feed the commissioning process. Let's learn about what's working, what's not. Let's use that information to prioritize our investments about how to tweak the building so it's working well, and then come back. So that's one of the things that we're doing, and you could do that with surveys or physical measurements, and the tools that you use to evaluate how a building works really depends on what your questions are. So that's one way.
How many of you are familiar with what commissioning is? Is that a term you've heard before? Because it's actually not that commonly understood by lay people, and I think lay people will say, well, if I already hired an engineer, this is normally we're talking about engineering systems, why on earth do I have to hire a whole nother set of engineers to make sure that everything was installed properly and it's all working properly? So, we had gone through a process of doing post-occupancy studies on 10 of our green buildings, And there's many other studies with much larger survey pools in the industry, but it was compelling to me because these were buildings we knew a lot about, that we saw that the buildings that were not commissioned were performing approximately 30 to 40% worse than they were predicted during design. So that's kind of a shocking number. And I'd heard that in other studies before, and I'd seen it published, but then when we saw it in our own buildings, it was sort of like, it really is a remarkable difference. So there is a trend in the industry to encourage. There are people becoming commissioning engineers. It didn't used to be common. Now it's becoming more and more common. Owners still have trouble paying for commissioning because they don't like the idea that they paid for something that was supposed to be done right the first time. But there's now a greater and greater understanding that if you don't pay for commissioning up front, you basically pay for it over time in repairs and maintenance over time. So you really do pay for it one way or the other. And it really is probably the most important thing that can be done besides trying to get a good design. It's probably the next most important thing. You know, that it's not really worth it to invest in a good design if it's not going to be delivered properly, and it's not going to basically.
It's not just the design; it's the operation.
It's the operations, and what they typically find when a building is commissioned, they'll typically find that this fan over here is sucking instead of blowing, you know, and it's like the fan was installed literally backwards. I mean, they find crazy things, and there's a reason why, anyway, sometimes people are uncomfortable in buildings because they aren't necessarily commissioned.
Of course, it raises the interesting question of why was the fan installed backwards? I mean, why can't we get to the point where it's done the first time and the commissioning piece is a small, fast, quick piece that only influences things by 5%?
One of the reasons for that is that every building is a prototype. Now, every building, every once in a while you get two buildings that are the same, but and if you look at the amount of investment in the design process for a building, it's of order 10% or probably less, right, of that. Yet on other kinds of engineering projects, the design costs are much, much higher, and they figure those things out and they run through it. The example Steve gave of the New York Times, where they actually mocked up this part of the space, unprecedented, really unprecedented. And still, after that building is built, they're spending some serious effort commissioning the building to make it work right. Partly because they really took the time to understand what it should be doing. Most buildings, no one has a really clear idea, especially the operators of the building, what it should be doing. And so that closing that loop is so critical, it just never gets done adequately.
Okay, next question to whoever's farthest in the room, with the farthest hand I can see, there in the back corner. I know the front rows often get the benefits, so.
You touched on the idea of embodied energy in building materials. From that perspective, how are the use of green building materials promoted inside the industry? Is it, say, a manufacturer accesses an engineering firm who accesses an architect, or is it the architect who really needs to be made aware of these building materials and have them pull it through the value chain?
Well, Sandy, that's going to be yours.
The architect needs to be aware of the basic issues related to the materials they specify. But that said, they get an awful lot of help because the manufacturers do in our industry. They provide materials, and we have to sort through on what's greenwash and what's real. But there is a lot of material available. That said, when we look at embodied energy of materials in buildings, it's pretty well understood that about 90% of the embodied energy is in 5 material choices. So it may feel like a difficult issue to sort through, and it adds a layer of complexity, but it's actually, it's not that bad.
Would you touch on those 5 materials that you were mentioning? Concrete and drywall are 2 obvious ones.
Yeah, well, the structural frame, is it steel or is it concrete or is it wood? The enclosure system, what's the enclosure system? Which would then get into both glass as well as whether it's metal or masonry, et cetera. And they're very, very different embodied energy components related to those. The metals have much higher embodied energy, aluminum 10 times as much as steel. So those you're getting into the major ones, and then you'll get into the flooring and roofing and partitioning.
Okay, there was a hidden hand, I thought, back here. Yes.
Hi, I wanted to pick up on Stephen's comment about ESCOs possibly not working, and financing retrofit is clearly an important opportunity. So I was curious to see who might be working on these financing models, given the return is pretty brief, anywhere from 6 months to 3 years, and why perhaps the ESCOs, the proven alternatives and JCIs of the years in the 70s and 80s, might have worked, and what changed that, and perhaps whether the C40 initiative with financing for cities might leverage it, or who may be the institutions focusing on getting these numbers correct?
Well, here again, our missing panelist may be the best one able to answer that. Can anyone take that on?
I'll take a stab at some of it. So Bill Clinton's group has talked to a bunch of banks, and they put up $5 billion plus or minus and signed up a bunch of ESCOs. So you've got ESCOs to do the work, you've got the banks to finance it, and they've picked a bunch of cities, and they're trying to put engineering teams together in the cities and to go after what should be low-hanging fruit. I've talked to a few of the people involved, and again, this ESCO industry has been out there for a while. People I've talked to said that really not much has changed. The problems that were problems 5 and 10 years ago are still problems now. Having Clinton's name behind it helps a bit. Having a little easier access to funding helps a little bit. But again, it's the risk, the uncertainty, all of the kinds of issues and problems. I think there's room for, well, there's certainly room for innovation on the finance side. I think there's room for innovation on the technical side, the stuff that Charlie talked about. If you want to go in and rewire lighting and make it much better now, if you have to go up into the ceiling and pull out wires, you're dealing with asbestos and the time of people that's involved, which is very expensive. If you can do it with wireless cost effectively, that's better. So I think we'll see that just change slowly over time. I'm not sure that, I suppose, there's also a tax credit out there. Tax credit gives you a couple dollars a square foot for savings of 50% of the energy. And my belief is that some people have gone after that, but not in a big way. And so I think probably we just need to experiment more with a whole bunch of different strategies, options. I think the other thing, frankly, is that until now, or even now, it's not viewed as a big important problem. I mean, that was part of the lunchtime talk. It's an invisible problem to many people. Many building owners don't really understand how much energy they use. They don't understand how much they could use if they pursued it aggressively. The guys that left the lights on 24/7, that's UC facilities people. They're not dumb people. But there's just all these obstacles to sort of doing the right and sensible thing. And I think they just have to be pursued at all different levels at the same time to make a difference. And I think, let me just say that there's the old saying that you can't manage what you can't measure. And so better means to manage and expose things. So in Europe, there's an energy performance directive that says all buildings must publish the energy that they use. And I think there are some states or cities where when you sell or trade a building or something, you need to disclose what the energy use is. So things like that at the margin will help push us towards, I think, better policy in that regard.
Okay, back there.
So it has also been a lot of discussion about indoor air quality, and I was wondering how green building solutions interact with indoor air quality. Do they have an effect on it? And do they interact in some ways? So if you comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Charlie, you or I could probably do our survey summary.
Yeah, there's a number of ways to look at that. Maybe I'll start out. In green technologies can affect indoor air quality in good and bad ways. So maybe one of the things that has a lot of press over the last 20 years or so is that as buildings get tighter and tighter, we make them more energy efficient, there's less fresh air, and indoor air quality problems can get worse. And there's been a number of buildings that have supported the sick building syndrome associated with getting buildings tighter and tighter. So there's been a lot of attention to that recently in terms of providing proper ventilation for buildings and strategies to do that efficiently. The other side of, which is more in the more recent, say, 10 years or so of green building, is to look for materials that really change the emissions and sources of contaminants in a building. So using better materials that are improving the air quality in a space. And I think that's having a tremendously positive effect. And we've seen that in the results of a survey which we do where we survey occupants of buildings. And we've clearly demonstrated in buildings that are either LEED rated or green or somehow other certification or self-nominated as green buildings, that the occupant satisfaction with indoor air quality is statistically significantly better than the average building. So it's having a positive effect in that respect. And I think that it's catching on and becoming really the norm now to really be thinking about materials that are going into buildings.
Yeah, I'd like to tag on to that. In the 1970s, when there was an energy crunch, the legislation, the codes changed for buildings so that they wouldn't require as much fresh air. So you can look at the way it's tracked and see how much air used to be required and how it went plummeted in the 70s. The issue of concern about bad indoor air quality came up, and the rules were changed and it went back up. So it's no longer legal, it no longer passes code to save energy at the expense of indoor air quality, but there's a lingering concern about that because it happened a lot in the 70s, and some of those buildings are still around that were designed based on those older codes. So today, given the codes for fresh air requirements in buildings, it's no longer likely, it's no longer possible that there's going to be that kind of compromise with poor ventilation. And in fact, there's still the older buildings that do have that compromise, but I thought it was interesting when we were looking at post-occupancy studies to see that the most energy efficient buildings were actually scoring the highest in terms of thermal comfort, which is a component of indoor air quality. If people are they comfortable? Do they like the quality of the air in the indoor environment? And in fact, we've seen this, and I think others, it's been confirmed with your surveys as well, that the more energy efficient buildings, because they're less drafty and there's less radiant cooling, when you feel cold sitting next to an exterior wall, and there's better mixing of air, these buildings tend to actually create more comfortable environments today.
What about particulates?
Well, particulates an issue. There are a lot of issues about the actual stuff that's in air and the need. One of the innovations that CBE is very involved in is displacement ventilation, where air is supplied low and rises and is exhausted, and that carries particulates and carries contaminants away from people. People tend to get less sick in those buildings as well, because instead of mixing all the air around, there's a flow of air that takes contaminants away. So there are the newer strategies, and that's also an efficiency strategy, can create healthier environments.
Max, I know we started 10 minutes after the schedule. Are we cut short, or do we have 10 more minutes?
We have 10 minutes.
Okay. There was a question in the front here. I know you've been waiting patiently.
Well, you sort of answered some of it, but I was just wondering, are there new exciting green materials now that we didn't have 10 years ago that you guys are looking at to build buildings with, or are we still stuck with steel and stuff that takes a lot of energy to make?
Yeah.
Steve, you
I think the basic materials are the same. Certainly on the structural part, I think there's been innovation in the concrete area using fly ash and so on. That's a very energy-intensive piece. Yes, so that's an important one. I think in the whole world of wood, where wood comes from, how it's harvested, all of that has changed a lot. I mean, it's still, from the point of view of using wood, it's still there. I mean, wood is either a very good alternative if it's grown sustainably, or a poor alternative if you're clear-cutting, old-growth timber. So that raises an interesting question with all the materials, which is, if you're a designer, how do you know where the stuff comes from and what it really is? And if you force every designer in every decision to exhaustively research the pedigree of all this different stuff, costs go up and use goes down. So ultimately, rating and labeling systems are important, and we're seeing a lot of that. But I mean, people are still arguing, plastic versus paper, and is this stuff really good or not? Clearly, it's not good if it comes from Fiji, but what if it's bottled, across the way here? So there's a lot more to be done, I think, in understanding where materials come from, where they go. The other thing with materials, aluminum, is I think either very good if it came from a recycled source and will be recycled later. It's terrible if it comes from virgin ore and is used once and thrown away. So the life cycle of it, and when you buy it, do you know where it comes from? If you buy an aluminum window, do you have a clue as to where that came from? So I think what has to happen is the market has to say, we care about this. That information has to go back to the manufacturers. Some of them on their own will adopt better processes and procedures. And then in addition, you've got lead ratings and other voluntary mechanisms, or cities or counties or states who say, we'll only allow our projects to use certain kinds of materials. So it'll be a slow process, but hopefully the market will put pressure on it, and policy will change it as well.
I think one of the innovations we're seeing is a recognition that more durable materials it's almost returning to materials, but the more durable materials are really smart choices, and we're looking at longer term economics and calculating out the residual value, and the fact that it doesn't make sense to simply look at economics on a 30-year life cycle or a 15-year life cycle for a building, but that a more enlightened owner can say, well, at the end of that hypothetical life cycle, I may want to sell this building, and I'd like it to have some value when I sell it, instead of it being a building that needs to be torn down because it's obsolete and because it was built poorly in the first place. So I think the smarter investors are recognizing that the longer term horizon actually does make sense, and the building will still be there, and will it be a liability or an asset is significant. So, I mean, I think that's one of the innovations that's occurring.
And let me just say that there's plenty of other stuff going on. There's work on LEDs to replace fluorescents that will cut out the mercury and make them more efficient. There's coatings for windows that will change. There's going from a double glazed unit, instead of going to triple or quad glazing with the embodied energy in the glass, you have a coating that performs that well. So there's many places where innovation in the hardware will either save more energy or do the job the old one did using less materials and stuff. So there's those kinds of things go on a continuous basis.
I'd say the big innovation we're seeing in California right now is a look at radiant cooling technology in commercial buildings. That the Department of Energy had done a study looking at various new technologies and looking at the economic benefit of the various emerging technologies, and the radiant systems were at the very top of the list of not in the industry yet, but having a really high value and high return. And so, you know, maybe 10 years ago, everyone was looking at underfloor displacement ventilation. I think the thing that is emerging now in California is the radiant solutions that are using water for heating and cooling instead of pushing air around in buildings.
And it's a great system for integrating with operable windows, which makes sense in temperate climates like California. So you're separating the heating, cooling, the thermal functions, and the ventilation functions. There is a hand way on the side there.
I just have a superficial understanding of this area, but somebody was talking about, there's not a lot of VC money coming in, and from my perspective, from the tech transfer office, there's not a lot of clear IP. Sometimes the IP is all mixed up. It's consortiums, it's software, and so I'm wondering if I was a VC, what should I be looking for as far as tangible IP I can invest in and start a company around in the next, 5 years?
Charlie, you want to take that on?
It's a great question, and I don't claim any expertise there, other than just sort of my observations of trying to work with this. And what I found is,
I think was really unique. I mean, it's rare that your company had. I mean, you had a very unique.
And I think it's a great place to invest if there's any VCs out there. Charlie's not allowed to say that, but.
But the fact, the thing about IP is sort of strange in a lot of ways, and I think in the building industry, it's every industry kind of has their way they manage IP, I think, and the building industry seems very complex. Some players in the building industry are all about IP and protecting it and go after things. Other people really don't pay attention to it, and so in some of the technologies are about building hardware where you can, you have a piece of, you can protect that thing and be the only people to make it, and others have to do with managing information, as Steve is pointing out. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so it's very complex, and I think it is a barrier. I mean, I'm not saying that there's not reason for the fact that there's only 10% as much investment here. I'm not saying that people are but there's just an opportunity here. And I think that understanding that and working out the relationships between IP and understanding how it fits, because IP in a way is about, it applies very well to the biotech space. It applies very well to other sort of sectors. It doesn't really fit very well with with the building industry.
Yeah, I mean, IP is a means to an end. It's not an end to itself. So if what you're doing can be protected and you get a real market advantage, then it's important. But for some of the things we all talked about that are systems oriented, it's a much bigger thing. Now, being first to market, having a reputation that your stuff works, there may be a lot of other ways of getting a market advantage, and that may have value for an investor, and it may not be IP based, and I think that's a challenge. The other thing, classically in the building industry, there's a study from a while ago, I don't know if it's still valid, it probably is, that it takes about 15 to 20 years for an innovation to go from laboratory to mainstream use. Some of the things we're involved in the 80s, Lowy windows, are 60% market share now. Took 20 plus years, electronic valves 20 plus years. That's not the VC model. The VC model is 5 years, 7 years in and out. And so it may be that for a lot of what needs to happen here, either the VC model or the IP subset of that isn't the right model, and maybe we need a better, different model. There's still, I think the bottom line, since most of your business, there's a lot of money floating around out here. The building sector is a $1 trillion a year sector, and energy use in that sector is about $400 billion. So we spend $1.4 trillion a year in the US only, it's 3 or 4 times that globally, on making and repairing and powering buildings. And you got to believe that if you can capture even a small piece of that flow, there's money to be made. So there's a big opportunity, but I think we just need cleverer models to sort of dig in and change things and make them happen.
As a perspective, not all businesses are built on VC funding. Some of the largest corporations in the world
Sure.
certainly work. So.
Okay, we're going to have one last question. Sam.
Save the best for last. Yeah?
I actually don't have a question. I was just thinking about the VC question, and I think there probably is actually a great deal of IP that could be tied up as neatly as you want in these systems that measure and monitor and kind of report back on what's going on in buildings. That's classic information technology stuff that people have found lots of ways of monetizing in the past, software patents and so on. So I think that part of the market probably does have room for VC investment. Whether there's actually a market big enough to go after is perhaps more to the point.
Well,
the other thing that I wanted to say is I think a lot of efficiency plays are going to require innovation in business models, and ESCOs are a glimpse of that. But I think among other things, venture capitalists are connoisseurs of business models, and they may not have found one that they think is perfectly market transforming in the efficiency space, but I think there's certainly potential for a model to come up that they get really excited about as well.
Mm-hmm. Let me add one comment to that, which could be important. In the building industry, most owners don't want to be locked into a proprietary system that only you offer. There's a big change now in the industry to open systems. Actually, it's true of other areas as well, right? People prefer open systems rather than being locked into closed models. And so that, I think, at the margin anyway, argues against some of the IP. If you have the only way of doing something in some small area, and I'm a business owner and I say, am I going to buy that system because if 5 years later it needs to be repaired or expanded in some way because my building expands, and I can only go to one vendor to get it because you own the IP. Now, of course, if you own the IP, you could license it more broadly. But the whole issue of open versus closed systems is one that's, I think, quite important. There are interoperability issues in the building industry that are sort of rising slowly but steadily to being more and more important. Mm-hmm. So that somehow is an overlay here, and I'm not quite sure how, but it's important.
Okay, well, I know our plenary is about to begin, so I want to thank our speakers. And thank you to the audience for some excellent questions.